At this time, I would like to call upon our keynote speaker, and this is Homi Kharas. Homi is well known to all of us here, not just in Washington, but around the world. And most recently, currently, Homi is the Senior Director of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Homi, look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to FAO and the other agencies for a really tremendous report. And I think that the idea that we have to systematically monitor outcomes under the SDGs as a very preliminary first step in actually getting to these goals is really important, but it is also really important to understand this is only a very first step. So I want to, we've just heard things aren't going well. This is not news. What I want to emphasize here is that we have now had quite a long period where, regardless of the indicators, the progress on hunger just is not particularly encouraging. And so I would say that we can, say at this point, we are off track. We know that the numbers, absolute numbers, are increasing, not decreasing in terms of hungry people, whether you do it in, shares or in the absolute numbers of people. Yes, there's been some progress on stunting, but if you just do the math, it would take us over 40 years at this rate for stunting to get to zero. I mean, just think about the implications of that. Here we are, everybody in this room knows that this is something which, with enormous implications for children and for the next generation, and we're saying let's wait for 40 plus years to be able to deal with this issue. The focus of SOFI was on the first two SDGs, but there's also other targets, the first two targets under SDG 2, but there's also other targets, including targets on productivity. In well over 60 countries, about 65 countries, and these are the countries where the issues are particularly acute, productivity is flat and low. There is no evidence that this is really improving. So part of this new FIES scale is based on the Gallup poll data. Gallup asks this question: have there been times that you don't have enough money to buy food that you or your family needed? This sample is the sample of all countries, not just those countries which have actually had their governments approve the release of the data. And the point I want to emphasize here is, look at this. This is 10 years. 10 years of asking the same question. Show me that this is a dramatic improvement. The point is that this is not just a 1 or 2 year issue related to these famines. This is a long-standing structural issue, and we have to understand that in that context. And it's true in both the top line here is low-income countries, the next line is middle-income countries, and the bottom line is high-income countries. And I think it's also important there just to see that even in so-called high-income countries, there does exist a hunger problem. And I'm really delighted that in SOFI, the principle of universality that goes throughout the SDGs has been brought out in their metrics. Looking at the outcomes is one thing, but I think if you want to really get a picture of what is happening, and if you want to look a little bit into the future, it's useful to also look at the so-called determinants. And in the work that we've been doing at Brookings, we have essentially said, let's separate the determinants into two big buckets. One bucket is what I would call policies and institutions and government commitment, and the other bucket is resources. So we've looked at these individually. Okay, so again, FAO has this index they call the Agricultural Orientation Index. It's sort of a metric of whether governments are putting their money in proportion to how they should into agriculture. It's actually trending down. Down is bad in this instance. So that's not a very good thing. And in those countries where the need is highest, the index is lowest. Look at what's happening to trade. WTO reports 1124 non-tariff barriers initiated in 2016. It's going up. It's not going down. Look at what is happening to subsidies. I'm about to show you a picture on producer subsidies, but if you look at agricultural producer subsidies, the producer subsidies are about 85% anyway of total subsidies, but producer and consumer subsidies, we are spending $550 billion a year in the world on subsidies, and we're still not getting anywhere. By the way, ODA for food and nutrition security is somewhere around 10 to 11 billion per year, just to put these numbers in context. So this is, again, what I would say is generally bad news. The only small glimmer is that there was an agreement in Nairobi at the WTO ministerials for advanced countries to phase out their export subsidies, and Australia was the first country this year to actually make good on that commitment. This is a graph of subsidies, producer subsidies, taken from OECD data. You can see the top line is OECD countries. The bottom line is China. And essentially, I think the pattern is very clear. OECD countries are gradually coming down, but in China, the subsidy level is shooting up. And actually, I saw that Shenggen Fan, director of the Institute, just had a very nice piece on China, pointing out that they have had sharp increases in domestic procurement prices, which has resulted in much more production, but not much more consumption. The production is just going into stocks. So they're building up large stocks of food. This is more an income transfer to farmers rather than something which is really aimed at food and nutrition security. Resources. Resources, of course, are dominated by private credit. FAO have now got a new series on private credit. I'm delighted that they're pushing the expansion of data that's made available. But from what we can tell, it's flat. Government spending, for the few countries, we've got about 39 countries where there's comparable data year to year. It's actually going down. ODA, maybe some small increases, etc. But ODA is just not big enough to make a real difference. So resources are just not there. And when we look at the simple correlations, and actually we've done some empirical work, so these are not just correlations. There's also some evidence to suggest that there may be some causality here. The countries that actually spend more on food and nutrition security have much better outcomes. And what I want to really hammer home here is the idea that in a number of middle-income countries, they're spending about, $300 or so per rural person per year on food and nutrition security. In the poorest countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, these numbers are less than $10 per person per year. Per year. What do you think you're going to get from an investment of $10 per year? So if we're really serious about changing this, we have to move some of these numbers. So if I were to say, where are we in terms of SDG monitoring? We're 2 years in. No progress on the outcome side. Nothing much changed in terms of government policies or commitments, despite all the rhetoric. And essentially, resources are flat. Why should we expect anything to change when nothing changes other than the talk? Here's a correlation between food prices and ODA for food and nutrition security. Guess what? When you have a food price spike, everybody gets excited, ODA for FNS goes up, then food prices start to come down as they have today, and everybody forgets about FNS. You will not solve this problem if we still have volatility in food and nutrition security funding of this kind of nature. We need to find a way of making these things much more stable, much more reliable, something that countries can actually program into long-term programs. So our sense is that this is really a story about accountability. And in the system that we have, there's no single agency that one can say, these are who is accountable. What we really need is we need lots of data so that civil society in lots of different countries can actually start to hold their governments to account. We need developed countries to start to shift from just making promises when there are crises to actually having long-term sustained commitment of support, which is demonstrated, cut down on their volatility, follow through on commitments, like the export subsidy commitments. We need developing countries to actually have credible national strategies. Right now, there are a proliferation of strategies on food and nutrition security. So countries are doing zero hunger challenge strategies. Countries are doing strategies for GAFSP, for funding. Countries are doing strategies for the high-level political forum when they make their voluntary contributions, what they're doing about the SDGs. We've looked at a comparison of countries who do strategies in all three of these things. They're not the same. They don't look alike. These are box-ticking exercises where somebody says you've got to have a strategy, so somebody in some ministry somewhere produces a strategy. It isn't serious. So I'll end there by essentially saying, I hope that people use this report to inject a certain sense of urgency into this discussion and to stop just saying things are bad and things are getting worse and, oh my goodness, there's not much that we can do about it. There is an awful lot that we can do about it. We're just not doing it. Thank you very much.